At 05:32 hours, 18th October 1944, on the tarmac at North Field, Isley Field, Saipan, the engines roar in the morning mist. Corporal Richard Rick Harper grips the oil dipstick of the right outboard engine of his Boeing B-29 Superfortress, Iron Maiden, thumbs a bead of sweat from his brow. The engine, the monstrous 18-cylinder, twin-row Wright R-3350 Duplex-Cyclone, hums under his gloved fingers. He's just cleared a 2,600 horsepower run-up, listening for that subtle valve tap that too often becomes a flameout. Overhead, the control tower crackles a radio log. Scheduled takeoff, Roy 6.15, route Tokyo area, fuel load 9,600 gallons, bomb load 20,000 pounds. Elsewhere, deep in a camouflage-painted factory in Germany, Luftwaffe technical intelligence officers pore over captured blueprints and wartime procurement files, puzzling how the Americans can stage long-range missions from Saipan, while Germany cannot. Rick staggers back from the engine cowling, breathing heavy, smell of avgas and hot steel, unaware that in Berlin an engineer is minutes from the revelation that will expose a vital truth. It isn't just the bomber's range, it's the engine that makes the difference. By 03:45 hours on that October morning, Rick Harper had already been awake for 2 hours. He rattled into the dawn-cold hangar at Chamorro Hill, boots splashing through puddles left from the monsoon the night before. The humid tropical air pressed against his face like a warm cloth. He was a 27-year-old ground crewman assigned to the 754th Bomb Squadron, 458th Bomb Group. Ahead of him loomed the hulking silhouette of Iron Maiden, her aluminum skin slick with condensation under the floodlights. He ran through the checklist automatically now. Oil levels, supercharger, bypass levers, magneto timing. A mechanic's routine, yes, but here, thousands of miles from home, rattled by losses, the routine felt fragile. Just yesterday, another B-29 had skidded off the runway, engine failure on takeoff. The wreckage still smouldered at the far end of the field. Rick stopped at the number 4 engine, lifted the cowling, and peered into the 2-row cylinder banks of the R-3350. 18 cylinders, twin-row radial, displacing 3,350 cubic inches. Each cylinder was the size of a coffee can. The ambient heat already began to climb. Rick wiped a smear of grease from his cheek. In the distance, the roar of a taxiing bomber shook the hangar doors. The mission was simple on paper: get Iron Maiden airborne by 06:15 and deliver incendiaries on Tokyo. But simple here didn't mean safe. The R-3350s had already caught fire on Saipan run-ups, 3 in the past month alone. Rick's fear was mechanical, but the aircrews fought fighters too. He glanced at the ground crew commander, Sergeant Miller, whose jaw was tight. So far, 2 out of 5 in the flight have engine overheating alarms, Miller said. His voice was flat, emotionless. We need those engines dry and stable, or we'll feed the Pacific. Rick nodded. In his gut, he knew. This bomber, this engine, this place, it all mattered. The sun still lurked below the horizon. Somewhere in the darkness, another engine fired up, coughed, then settled into a steady roar. Rick heard the distant misfire and felt his stomach tighten. This wasn't routine. Half a world away, in a cavernous factory space deep in the Ruhr industrial district near Berlin, Oberleutnant Klaus Reinhardt flipped through a bundle of seized American documents. The date was 14th of December 1944. The time was 10:17 hours. His unit was part of the Luftwaffe's technical intelligence branch, Technische Entwicklung und Erprobung. The file before him, a procurement summary of the Wright R-3350 engine. its production variants, including the Dash 41 model that powered the B-29. He read the specifications carefully. Twin-row 18 cylinders, 3,350 cubic inches displacement, 2,200 to 3,500 horsepower, depending on model and configuration. But what stuck in Klaus's mind was not the raw power. It was the range figures of a B-29 launching from Saipan, 2,700 miles round trip, carrying heavy bomb loads. Why couldn't Germany stage that kind of sortie? He rolled up the file and marked one note in the margin. Fuel flow and cooling issue at tropical base. He knew Germany's engines, like the BMW 801 Radial, excelled in Europe but not in the Pacific's heat and runway length requirements. The BMW 801 delivered 1,600 to 2,000 horsepower at best. Respectable, but not enough. Klaus walked to an adjacent test bench where a jerry-built copy of one row of the R-3350 sat, bolted to a steel frame. His team had been trying to reverse engineer it for months. He flipped the switch, the engine spun, coughed twice, then steadied. The room vibrated. He felt the shock travel through the concrete floor. He realized this was the engine that gave the Americans their strategic edge, and if Germany could not match it, the war elsewhere might tilt beyond recovery. He turned to a map of the Marianas pinned to the wall and drew a line with a grease pencil. Saipan to Tokyo. Then he wrote in the margin, "Engine makes the difference." Outside the factory, snow fell lightly on the rubble-strewn streets. The war was closing in, but Klaus's mind was on an engine half a world away. By 05:45 hours, Rick was on final pre-flight. The hangar's floodlights cast long reflections on the wet concrete. Iron Maiden's 4 R-3350s gleamed under de-icing fans and preheat blowers, though in the tropics the term de-icing was a misnomer. Rick checked the engine cowls. They were hot to the touch already. Run-up data from this morning showed cylinder head temperatures creeping beyond operational thresholds. The delivery paper in his hand read, "CHT peak, 560 degrees Fahrenheit on number 3 under 90-second taxi." Rick radioed his findings to the flight engineer aboard the bomber. "Sir, just a heads up. Number 3's CHT sneaking high. Recommend static run-up delay." The flight engineer looked back at him through the cockpit window, his face shadowed by his headset. "Time's tight, Harper. We launch in 20. Rick swallowed. The pressure was mounting. The aircraft was fully loaded with incendiaries, fuel tanks topped to maximum capacity. Any engine failure on takeoff and the bomber was dead weight on a too-short runway. He gripped the engine start handle, counted the seconds as the propeller spun up. The roar came. 1, 2, 3, 4 engines on. The ground shook as Iron Maiden taxied out, her wheels leaving wet tracks on the concrete. Rick exhaled slowly. He knew the mission ahead would be brutal. Over 3,000 miles round trip, high risk of enemy fighters, flak over the target, and the tropical heat now rising above 90 degrees. He watched the bomber roll toward the runway, gather speed, and lift into the dawn. He hoped the engines would hold. The tower voice crackled over the loudspeaker. "All B-29s airborne. Good luck. Weather at target, heavy cloud layer at 8,000 feet. Rick stood on the tarmac, watching the bombers disappear into the pale morning sky. Around him, other ground crews began cleaning up, preparing for the next wave. But Rick couldn't shake the feeling. He'd heard the slight hesitation in engine number 3 during run-up. A tiny skip in the rhythm. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. At 08:12 hours, Iron Maiden climbed out into the blue Pacific dawn. At 16,000 feet, the air was cold. The 4 R-3350s settled into cruise configuration. In the cockpit, the flight engineer monitored manifold pressures, RPM, fuel flow, cylinder head temperatures, and oil temperatures. A chill wind slapped across the plexiglass nose as the bomber pierced through scattered clouds. Back on the ground, Rick now stood in the operations tent, watching radar plots track the aircraft as green dots on a screen. His throat tightened. The bomber crew was 8 minutes ahead of schedule, but the ground crew log still showed those rising CHTs on the last run-ups. Suddenly a radio message crackled through. Crew per fuel gauge. Add 50 gallons to number 2 tank at Tinian. Rick realized the weight was extra. The engineers had added jettisonable tanks to gain range. The ghosts of earlier raids loomed in his memory. High-altitude precision bombing from China-Burma-India routes had failed to deliver results. Now the Marianas bases allowed direct strikes on the Japanese home islands, but only if the R-3350s delivered uninterrupted power for hours on end. He remembered the technical manual. Twin-stage supercharger, carburetor issues on early models, late-war fuel injection retrofit in the -41 variant. The improvements were real, but so were the risks. Back in Berlin, Klaus read a decrypted radio intercept delivered by courier. B-29 mission outbound Saipan, 10-ship mass, estimated target Tokyo Industrial District. His heart sank. His team's copies of the R-3350 engine still didn't solve the overheating problem and tropical conditions. The metallurgy was close, but the cooling baffle design eluded them. He made a decision. If possible, capture a working engine from the Pacific Theater. A long shot, but worth pursuing. On Rick's radar screen, a blip appeared. Unidentified fighter escort at 30,000 feet ahead of the bomber stream. He tensed. His hand hovered over the radio transmit button. Then the blip resolved. Quote, friendly P-51 Mustangs out of Iwo Jima, extended range escort. He exhaled. The mission continued. On 19th of December 1944 at 14:30 hours, Klaus convened his engineering cell in a dim-lit hall beneath the factory complex. Under harsh fluorescent lights, the engine mock-up stood on its test frame like a mechanical sculpture. He ordered precise measurements: bore, stroke, supercharger gear, ratios, valve timing, combustion chamber geometry of the R-3350. The team used blueprints and photographs smuggled out of Saipan Mariana's intelligence networks. Slowly, they discovered the R-3350's crucial advantage: high power output and long-haul reliability when properly cooled and maintained. The earlier wartime data showed many failures due to overheating, particularly in the tropical environment, but the USAF crews at Saipan had improved the cooling baffle design, adjusted cowl flaps for better airflow, and adopted stricter temperature thresholds to prevent engine fires. Klaus pointed to a chart on the wall. German radial BMW 801's takeoff power ranged from 1,600 to 2,000 horsepower. Compare that with the R-3350's 2,200 to 3,500 horsepower. The difference wasn't marginal, it was fundamental. If we cannot match the power to reliability ratio, Klaus said to the assembled engineers, the Americans will maintain operational reach. The Luftwaffe cannot. The team nodded in silent agreement. The strategic implications were clear. Then Klaus wrote a note on the chalkboard. Quote, focus on cooling, spares availability, runway length requirements. These were the 3 pillars of the American advantage. A courier entered the hall, snow still clinging to his overcoat. He handed Klaus a new photocopy. Saipan maintenance log, 3 engine fires in takeoff roll this month, corrected by extended run-up to 20 minutes. Klaus studied the document. Even with failures, the Americans adapted. They extended pre-flight procedures, stockpiled spare parts, and kept flying. Germany, by contrast, was running out of time, fuel, and industrial capacity. The R-3350 wasn't just an engine, it was a system, and systems required resources Germany no longer had. Outside, the winter afternoon darkened early. Klaus looked at the mock-up engine one more time. It sat there, incomplete and cold, a symbol of what might have been. He turned off the lights and left the hall in silence. At 11:45 hours on 18th of October, inside Iron Maiden's cockpit high above the Pacific, the bombardier called down, "Target in sight, Yokohama Harbor, bearing 312 degrees. The bomber had arrived over Japan, back at Saipan. Rick watched the radar return flicker on the screen. The formation was now inbound on the target. But his worry returned. Earlier missions had climbed to 25,000 feet for precision bombing and returned with scant hits, thanks to jet stream winds and bombing inaccuracy. Now they were bombing at lower altitudes, around 9,000 to 10,000 feet, to improve accuracy and carry heavier loads. The R-3350s strained under the additional load, plus heat from the engine bay, plus conditions over Japan, flak, fighters, heavy fuel consumption. Rick checked the telemetry feed from the ground crew radio link. Engine number 4 showing oil pressure drop. He grabbed the headset and yelled, "Ground crew Johnson to Iron Maiden. Oil PSI number 4 trending downward. Reduce cruise RPM by 50 until landing." The pilot acknowledged. Inside the bomber, the engine tone deepened as RPM was throttled back. The plane wobbled slightly. The ammo bay rattled. Crew members exchanged worried glances. The mission could not end with only 3 engines. The bomber was loaded too heavy to ditch safely in open ocean. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Klaus's intelligence report received a new intercept later that evening. 20th Air Force bomber formation drops incendiary load. City consumed. 16 square miles destroyed. He stared at the numbers. The Americans were not only reaching Japan, they were destroying its urban centers from afar, systematically and repeatedly, and the engine at the heart of it all was the R-3350. He underlined the phrase in red ink, 16 square miles. On the Saipan radar screen, one bomber suddenly dropped off the formation. No response to radio calls. Rick's stomach dropped. He stared at the empty space on the screen where the blip had been. 30 seconds passed. Then a faint signal returned. Damaged, but flying. The crew had feathered an engine and limped back into formation. Rick released a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. By 19:20 hours, darkness had fallen over Saipan. The bomber stream returned. Rick stood by the hot pad under yellow floodlights, watching the tail numbers of each B-29 light up as they taxied in. The air smelled of burned avgas and hot exhaust. Iron Maiden glided in, 3 propellers winding down, one silent and feathered. Rick leaped into action. He opened the cowling and sniffed the engine bays. All 4 had run, but number 2, oil sump, was warm, coolant temperature high. He flagged it immediately. Post-flight inspection, immediate on number 2. The crew chief grunted acknowledgement. In the debrief tent, the flight commander gave his report. "We lost 1 ship, engine fire on takeoff from Tinian, close to velocity threshold, clipped wing on taxi barrier, had to ditch in the sea. 11 of 13 crew rescued by destroyer escort." Rick shuddered. He knew the statistics. Of the 334 bombers launched on the massive Tokyo raid of 9th of March 1945, which would come months later, 55 would be forced, ditchings or combat losses. The numbers were brutal. As the ground crew worked on Iron Maiden through the night, Rick noted the difference in maintenance cycles here versus stateside training. The ground crew overhaul and maintenance cycle was intensive. 75 hours between major inspection. Factory manuals specified even shorter intervals in tropical climates. The R-3350's design had to be adapted constantly for these conditions. He pulled up a maintenance log entry. Cylinder number 4, rear bank cooling skirt cracked after 12 flights. He frowned. They were pushing the engines close to their limits. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Klaus's team had assembled a working virtual model of the R-3350 using captured data. They marked critical challenges: metallurgy of the crankcase used magnesium alloy, which was fire-prone at temperatures exceeding 560 degrees Fahrenheit when burning. They concluded, unless Germany could field an engine of similar output, operating from island bases with long-range strategic missions would remain an American privilege. Rick glanced up at the star-filled sky. In the distance, he heard the drone of an engine run up at midnight. B-29s already prepping for the next strike. The war didn't sleep. On 15th of January 1945 at 09 hours, Klaus presented his findings to Oberstleutnant Weber, head of the Luftwaffe's Erprobungsamt test office. He laid out a slide comparison: R-3350 versus BMW 801 versus Junkers Jumo 222 on power density, cooling margin, service hours in tropics. The figures stunned the room into silence. The BMW 801 had poor high-altitude performance beyond 20,000 feet. The Junkers Jumo 222 was still in prototype phase, plagued by delays and design flaws. Germany's bomber engines could not match the sustained power output and endurance of the R-3350 as flown from the Saipan. Klaus stated plainly, "Without deep run endurance and tropical cooling systems, we cannot contest the Marianas Tokyo operational axis." Weber leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. He knew Germany's strategic bomber campaign was faltering. Resources were being diverted to fighter defense of the homeland. Long-range strategic bombing was an American luxury Germany could no longer afford. Klaus then showed reconnaissance imagery obtained via U-boat intercepts, long runways at Eastleigh Field, massive infrastructure, engine maintenance depots, spare R-3350 assemblies stockpiled in open-air warehouses. He said, "They solved the logistics behind the engine too. It's not just the design, it's the supply chain, the spare parts, the maintenance doctrine." The room remained silent. The implications were clear. He closed his presentation. "Our task now, reverse engineer what we can, or sabotage their logistic chain if opportunity arises." Weber tapped the map with his knuckle. Saipan Logistic Hub noted, strategic target for remaining U-boat operations. But both men knew the truth. Germany's submarine fleet was decimated. The Atlantic was lost. The Pacific was unreachable. The R-3350 would continue to fly. Klaus gathered his papers and left the briefing room. Outside, the corridors were cold. Steam pipes hissed overhead. He thought of the American ground crews working under floodlights on a tropical island, pulling cylinder heads, replacing gaskets, retiming magnetos. They had the infrastructure. Germany had blueprints and desperation. In war, he realized, the engine that runs wins over the engine that's perfect on paper. At 0450 hours on 9th of February 1945, thunderstorms lashed Saipan. The base was slick with rain. Rick's boots splashed across taxiways as he jogged to Hangar 4. Inside, engineers fought against time. One R-3350 had cracked a cylinder barrel during the previous day's mission. They pulled the assembly out under fluorescent lights, oil dripping onto the concrete floor like black rain. Rick helped carry the barrel bank. It weighed over 80 pounds. Sweat mixed with rain-wet hair. They replaced the barrel, inspected the supercharger gear train, checked valve clearances with feeler gauges. The mission scheduled for tomorrow. Strike on Kobe, Japan. The bomber would depart at 0630 hours, return 14 hours later. The strain on the R-3350s would be immense. Extended cruise at high power settings, formation flying, combat maneuvering over the target. Rick closed the cowling and stepped back, wiping his hands on a rag. He glanced at the logbook entry. Engine number 3, front row cylinder number 12, cracked after 15 flights at temps above 580 degrees Fahrenheit. He thought, if that happens in flight, it's fire, loss of oil pressure, maybe loss of the entire bomber. He took a deep breath and signed off on the repair. Back in Berlin, Klaus received word via decoded maintenance telegram from Saipan. Number 2 engine run-up deferred due to manifold pressure drop. The Americans were fighting reliability issues, but they were still flying massive missions, sometimes 300 bombers in a single raid. Klaus realized the breakthrough wasn't just the engine design. They had accepted a certain failure rate, built massive spare inventories, adapted maintenance procedures in the field. He marked his final analysis slide. Endurance wins wars. Not perfection, endurance. At 05:30 hours, Rick heard the bugle call echo across the flight line. Flight check begins. He grabbed his toolbox and headed back into the rain. Somewhere overhead, thunder rumbled. Or maybe it was engines. On Saipan, it was hard to tell the difference. High above the Sea of Japan at 9,000 feet, at 11:10 hours on 9th of February, Iron Maiden and 12 other B-29s approached the target. The R-3350s rumbled at high torque, maintaining 2,600 RPM, manifold pressure, at 49 inches of mercury. Suddenly, engine number 1 gave a sharp metallic pop. Oil pressure plummeted on the gauge. The pilot ordered immediate feathering of the propeller. The ship shuddered as asymmetric thrust pulled it left. The crew braced against their harnesses. The bombardier called up, 6 minutes to target, still on course. The flight engineer's voice was tight. RPM reduced to 2,400 on number 1, temperature climbing on number 4, CHT 590 degrees, and climbing. Back at Saipan radar control, Rick watched the formation dot flicker on the screen. His heart was in his throat. He radioed, "All units, we have 1 bomber reporting engine loss, still inbound on target." He knew the emergency procedures were rehearsed, spare parts were stocked, but the mission's margin for error was gone. 1 engine down meant reduced speed, reduced altitude capability, reduced chance of survival if intercepted. Inside Iron Maiden, the pilot ordered bomb bay doors opened early to reduce drag and lighten the load. The anti-flutter flaps delayed momentarily. The autopilot jolted. The navigator recalculated fuel consumption for 3 engine crews back to base. The numbers were tight. The bomber dropped its incendiaries over the Kobe Industrial District. Fires rose below like orange flowers blooming. Flames reflected off the pilot's visor as he banked away sharply, diving for speed. In Germany, Klaus received the intelligence intercept hours later. B-29 mission flew from Saipan, dropped incendiaries on Kobe, reached 15 square miles of destruction. He exhaled slowly. The R-3350 did what Germany's bomber engines could not, deliver sustained strategic power projection across thousands of miles of ocean. He wrote into his notebook, "Engine failure rate acceptable when logistic chain remains intact." The bomber struggled to hold altitude with 3 engines running. In the waist gun position, 1 crew member murmured a prayer. The ocean below looked very cold, very far down. By 16:45 hours, darkness fell over the island. Rick stood on the pad, waiting, watching the sky. Iron Maiden taxied in slowly. 3 propellers winding down, 1 silent and locked. The ground crew leapt into immediate action. Fire trucks rolled forward, foam cannons ready, safety crews standing by with axes and extinguishers. Rick leaped up the boarding ladder and climbed into the engine bay, flashlight in hand. He inspected the failed engine. The cylinder bank was charred black, evidence of an oil fire that had burned itself out. Yet the bomber had returned. The mission had succeeded. He noted in the logbook, "Engine number 1 failure, cylinder bank fire, replaced cylinder assembly required. Other 3 engines held operational parameters." He stood outside the bomber, ambient heat rising off the concrete, the smell of burnt metal heavy in his nostrils. Across the runway, the fuel truck sat idle, waiting for the next wave to be loaded. He knew tomorrow they would launch again. The R-3350 lineup had to hold. 1 failure was tolerated per mission, multiple failures were catastrophic. He sighed and closed the logbook. In Berlin, Klaus held an emergency technical meeting in the underground facility. His voice was steady but grim. "We are operationally behind. Recommend reinforced production of high-power radials immediately. Germany cannot match this engine effort in the remaining time available." The room remained silent. Everyone present knew the war was turning against them. The Allied advance from the west, the Soviet advance from the east, and now the strategic bombing campaign from the Pacific, all converging. And at the heart of the Pacific campaign was an engine Germany could not replicate. Rick looked up at the sky. Distant stars appeared through breaks in the clouds. Distant thunder of engines rolled across the island, maintenance run-ups, pre-flight checks, the endless cycle. He realized the island might be safe tonight, but the next 12 hours belonged to those engines and the men who flew them. He picked up his toolbox and walked back toward the hangar. There was always another bomber to prep, another engine to inspect. The war continued. By 4th of April 1945, at 02:20 hours, the Marianas night was quiet. The engine maintenance crews finally rested, but Rick remained awake, staring at the line of B-29s parked under floodlights. The ground crew chatter was soft now. Talk about engine improvements, better cowling flaps, the initiation of the Tropic Cycle maintenance program designed to shorten downtime on the R-3350s between major overhauls. The program was working. Engine reliability had improved measurably over the past 3 months. He recalled the earlier weeks: cylinder head cracking, fires on takeoff, emergency landings. But now the interval between major engine overhauls had stretched from 75 hours to nearly 100 hours under tropical conditions. The logistic train from the mainland shipped spare crankcases, cylinder banks, superchargers in steady flow. The key was not just superior design, it was comprehensive support. The US 20th Air Force had established engine rebuild depots right on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Full overhaul capability in theater. Rick walked down the flight line, running his hand along the cool aluminum cowling of the bomber he had just serviced. He whispered quietly, "You carried us." The bomber was more than metal and rivets and engineering. In its engines, its crew, its ground support, its logistics, its mission doctrine, it embodied the Allied strategic push toward Japan's home islands. He realized the engine had been the weak link at the start. Now it was the strength. The difference was adaptation, resources, and relentless maintenance discipline. On the island radio, a captured German language broadcast crackled through static. Luftwaffe radial engine shortage reported grave by Ministry of Armaments. Rick didn't speak German, but the translator on duty looked up and said simply, "They're running out of engines." Rick nodded. The war was being won, not just in the air, but on the ground, in the maintenance depots, in the supply ships crossing the Pacific, in the hands of men like him who kept the engines running. He turned off his flashlight and headed back to the barracks. 4 hours until the next shift. On 8th of May 1945, at 17 hours, the war in Europe ended. Klaus Reinhardt stepped into the rubble of a Luftwaffe engine plant outside Berlin. Soviet forces had occupied the eastern sector, American forces held the west. He carried one of the seized American engine logbooks in his hand. R-3350 41 variant, 146 sorties between major overhaul, average CHT 545 degrees Fahrenheit under tropical conditions. He flipped through the pages slowly. Another entry caught his eye. Loss rate B-29 due to engine fire or mechanical failure, 147 of 414 total losses, June through August 1945. The numbers were sobering. Even the Americans had struggled with the engine, but they had the resources to overcome it. Klaus closed the logbook. Behind him, German engineers under Allied supervision dismantled the test engines, catalogued parts for shipment to Wright Field in Ohio. They had reverse engineered much of the R-3350's design, but too late to change the war's trajectory, too late to matter. Klaus looked at a display board mounted on the wall. The engine gave the Americans the range and reliability to bomb Japan from island bases 1,500 miles distant. He nodded slowly. He had seen it in the mission logs, the maintenance records, the sortie counts, the photographic evidence. The engine had been the hinge upon which the Pacific Air Campaign turned. Not radar, not the atomic bomb, not even the bravery of crews, though all mattered. The engine made it possible. He stepped out into the grey evening sky of ruined Berlin. A group of Allied technical officers stood around a photograph of a B-29 taking off from Isley Field. The caption read, Wright R-3350 powered B-29 Superfortress operating 1,500 miles from Japanese home islands, April 1945. One officer looked at Klaus and nodded respectfully. Klaus returned the nod. He whispered to himself, You built the aircraft, we studied the engine, and it was yours to chase, never to catch. The truth was simple and final. The Wright R-3350 engine's power output, operational endurance, and logistic backing made possible the Marianas Japan bombing campaign. Germany's inability to field an equivalent aero engine meant it could never match that strategic reach. In the file, it was recorded as mechanical advantage. In history, it became the difference.